The 15th of September, 1940. Biggin Hill Airfield, south of London, 5 o'clock in the evening. Imagine the air, so thick with the smell of aviation fuel, hot oil, and freshly cut grass that you could cut it with a knife. It trembled, vibrated with an invisible tension, like a string stretched to its breaking point. In the pilot's ready room, which reeked of tobacco smoke, sweat, and fear, sat Flight Lieutenant Arthur Mallory. Sat. That is too active a word. He was spilled across the wicker chair like wax from a guttering candle. His 24-year-old face, which only 3 months ago had shone with brash, youthful confidence, now resembled a death mask of gray wax. His eyes, empty and faded like an old photograph, stared through the wall, through the hangars, through the leaden English sky into some private, infinite void. His hands, capable of gripping the Spitfire's controls and sending searing streams of death into the sky, lay limp on his knees. His fingers trembled slightly, the only proof that life still flickered within this body. He had flown 4 sorties today. 4. The word no longer had any meaning for him. 4 times he had soared into the sky, 4 times his world had narrowed to the crosshairs of his gun sight and the black silhouette of a Messerschmitt. 4 times he had returned to Earth, and each time, a piece of his soul remained up there, in the icy void at 10,000 feet. Squadron leader Alistair Finch, a stocky, stubborn man of 32 with a face carved from granite, stood in the doorway and looked at his best pilot. At his ace, his pride, his biggest problem. Finch knew that behind that empty gaze was something more than just fatigue. It was something worse. It was burnout, adrenaline poisoning, a state where the nervous system, overloaded to its absolute limit, simply shut down, refusing to send signals. Mallory wasn't scared. He wasn't depressed. He was empty. Finch walked over and placed a heavy hand on the pilot's shoulder. The body beneath the tunic didn't even flinch. "Arthur." Finch's voice was deliberately calm, almost lifeless. "Arthur, they're coming again. A large group, heading straight for London. I need you." Mallory slowly, with an effort that seemed to cost him his last ounce of strength, shifted his gaze to his commander. There was no fire in his eyes, no protest, only an endless, all-consuming apathy. "I can't, sir," he whispered, and the whisper was as dry as the rustle of autumn leaves. My hands won't obey me. I can't feel the pedals." Finch squeezed his shoulder harder, trying to transmit a spark of his own unbending will through that simple touch. "You're an ace, Arthur. You're the best we have. You can fly with your eyes closed. Just get to the plane. Your body will do the rest." He was lying. He knew he was lying. In this state, a pilot was more dangerous than any Messerschmitt. He was a ticking time bomb, ready to explode at any moment. But Finch had no choice. Everyone who could fly was already in their cockpits, their engines warming up, creating a deafening roar that shook the very ground. And at that exact moment, slicing through the roar, the air raid siren began to wail, piercing, desperate, like the cry of a wounded animal. That sound was the soundtrack to their lives. It was their alarm clock, their funeral march, and their lullaby, all in one. Mallory flinched as if from an electric shock. His pupils dilated for a moment, and something resembling awareness flickered within them. Horror. He looked at his trembling hands, then back at Finch. His gaze held a silent question. How did we get to this point? Finch saw the question. He saw it every day in the eyes of his boys. And he had no answer. There was only an order that had to be obeyed. But to understand how the best pilot in the Royal Air Force had turned into a living corpse, how a squadron of heroes had found itself on the brink of collective suicide, we must go back 60 days, to that hot, hopeful day in July when their personal hell was just beginning. July 1940. The same Biggin Hill airfield, but it was a different world. The air smelled different then. not of soot and anxiety, but of blooming linden trees, fresh bread from the village bakery, and the carefree ease of a long summer day. The war, of course, was on. France had fallen, the army had miraculously escaped from Dunkirk, and everyone understood that the decisive battle for Britain was about to begin. But this understanding was theoretical, academic. It lived in newspaper headlines and Churchill's radio speeches, but it hadn't yet settled into the hearts of these young men in the blue uniforms of the Royal Air Force. They were the nation's golden youth, its knights of the sky. They still believed in duels, in a code of honor, in the idea that war was a gentleman's sport, just with higher stakes. That day, 19-year-old pilot officer James Croft, or simply Jimmy, arrived at the squadron. He was the quintessence of this naive faith. Fresh, pink-cheeked, with eyes burning with excitement, he looked at the squadron's veterans as if they were gods descended from Olympus, especially Arthur Mallory. Mallory was different then. He was quick, witty. His laughter boomed in the mess hall, and he already had 7 German planes to his name. He was a living legend, and Jimmy couldn't believe his luck. He would be flying in the same squadron as the Ace Mallory himself. He remembered the first time he walked into the ready room. Mallory and a few other pilots were playing cards, laughing loudly and drinking beer, even though it was only noon. Squadron leader Finch sat in a corner reading a newspaper, only occasionally looking up and surveying his men with a gaze that mixed fatherly pride with a barely perceptible anxiety. Jimmy, shifting from foot to foot, introduced himself. Mallory looked up from his cards, gave him an appraising look, and smiled broadly. "Another lamb to the slaughter," he said cheerfully. But there was no malice in his voice, only friendly mockery. "Welcome to the circus, Jimmy. The main rule is, don't try to be a hero. Heroes don't last long. Our job is to survive." Those words seemed to Jimmy then to be part of some ritual, the bravado of experienced warriors. He didn't understand their true, deeper meaning. He saw confident young men, the best pilots in the country. He didn't see the fine lines around their eyes, didn't notice how their hands sometimes froze halfway to a mug, didn't hear how some of them cried out in their sleep at night. He only saw the gleaming surface, polished boots, perfectly pressed uniforms, daring smiles. He didn't know that beneath this armor lay nerves stretched to their limit. He didn't know that their laughter was too loud, their jokes too desperate. It was a defense mechanism, a way to deceive the fear that lived in each of them. That evening, sitting on his bunk, Jimmy wrote a letter to his mother. He enthusiastically described the airfield, his brand new Spitfire, which he stroked along the fuselage as if it were a living horse. He wrote about the legendary Arthur Mallory, who had shaken his hand. "Mother," he wrote, "you can't imagine what these men are like. They're made of steel. They're afraid of nothing. I'm so proud to be one of them." He sealed the envelope, unaware that it was the last letter in which he would ever write the word proud. In the following days, he began to notice strange things. For example, the veterans never talked about the fighting. They could spend hours discussing a new movie, arguing about football, or telling tall tales about their girlfriends. But as soon as one of the newcomers tried to ask them about a dogfight, the conversation would die out. It was as if there were an unwritten rule: don't bring the horror of the sky down to earth. He noticed that many pilots had their own little rituals. One always flew with a tattered teddy bear in his pocket. Another listened to the same record before every sortie. Mallory always knocked 3 times on the propeller of his plane. These were not just superstitions. They were anchors that kept their sanity from dissolving in the chaos of war. Finch, their commander, seemed to see everything. He knew each of his pilots inside and out. He knew who was sleeping poorly, who had started drinking too much, whose hands trembled after a flight. He was their commander, father, and psychologist all in one. He tried to create a cocoon of normal life around them to protect them from what awaited them in the sky. But he understood that this cocoon was incredibly fragile. That evening at the end of July, when the radio announced the start of Operation Adlertag, Eagle Day, silence fell over the mess hall for the first time. The music stopped. The laughter died. Everyone looked at Finch. He slowly folded his newspaper, stood up, and said just one sentence. "Gentlemen, tomorrow the real work begins." And in his voice for the first time, Jimmy heard not steel, but an endless, hollow weariness. He didn't yet know that this day would be the last day of his youth, the last day he believed in heroes made of steel. Tomorrow, he would understand that they were made of the same flesh and blood as he was, and that this flesh burned just as brightly. The 13th of August, 1940. Eagle Day. The sky, which an hour ago had been clear and serenely blue, suddenly turned black. Not with clouds. It turned black with hundreds of German bombers and fighters advancing on England in endless waves. For Jimmy Croft, this was his first real combat. Everything he had been taught in flight school, all the training flights, all the theories and diagrams, it all turned to dust in the first 30 seconds. Chaos. That was the only word to describe it. Imagine being inside a giant kaleidoscope, its fragments a chaos of airplanes, tracer bullets, shreds of clouds, and the blinding flashes of explosions. Everything spun, hurtled, and mixed with the deafening roar of hundreds of engines, the chatter of machine guns, and the dry crack of shells piercing the skin of your aircraft. Earth, sky, horizon, it all lost meaning. The only reality was the enemy. The black cross on the wing of a Messerschmitt Bf 109 that had glued itself to your tail. Jimmy acted on pure reflex. His body, trained by hundreds of hours, pulled back on the stick on its own, sending the Spitfire into a steep bank, his feet pressing the rudder pedals, making the machine dance across the sky. His brain was paralyzed with terror. He saw the plane of his wingman, the boy he'd had breakfast with that morning, turn into a fireball right next to him. He didn't even have time to scream. There was no time for emotion. There was no time for anything but survival. And then he saw it. Directly in front of him, in his gun sight, a German Dornier bomber hung for a split second. Time slowed down. Jimmy saw everything in minute detail, the face of the rear gunner, his eyes wide with terror. And he squeezed the trigger. The 8 machine guns of his Spitfire spat a lethal torrent. He watched as the bullets ripped through the Dornier's fuselage, as pieces of its skin flew off, as black smoke poured from an engine. The bomber pitched forward and began to fall, slowly, almost majestically, leaving a trail of black smoke behind it. He had done it. He had shot down an enemy. But instead of triumph, instead of the joy of victory, he felt only an icy emptiness and nausea. He had just killed men. He had seen the eyes of one of them. The thought seared his brain. But there was no time for that, either. The calm, icy voice of Arthur Mallory crackled in his headphones. "Jimmy, you've got one on your tail. Brake left now." Jimmy snapped back to reality and threw his plane into a turn. A stream of tracer bullets zipped past. Mallory, like a guardian angel, appeared out of nowhere and chased the Messerschmitt off his tail. The battle raged for another 15 minutes, which felt like an eternity to Jimmy. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The sky was empty. Finch's voice crackled over the radio, gathering his depleted flock. "Returning to base." 3 words that sounded like the most beautiful music in the world. When Jimmy landed his bullet-riddled Spitfire, it wasn't just his hands that were shaking, but his entire body. A mechanic, an old man nicknamed Chiefy, helped him out of the cockpit. "A good start, son," he said, seeing the victory marking that someone had already painted on the fuselage. Jimmy said nothing. He walked to the ready room and collapsed into a chair, unable to even remove his flight helmet. He just sat and stared at a single point, replaying the face of that German gunner in his mind over and over. An hour later, just as he was beginning to recover, the siren wailed again. The second wave. Finch entered the room. His face was dark. 15 minutes to refuel and rearm. We'll have some tea. Then it's back in the sky. Jimmy looked at him with uncomprehending eyes. Again? So soon? He looked at the other pilots. They were silently drinking tea, their faces gray and inscrutable. Mallory walked over to Jimmy and handed him a mug. His hand was perfectly steady. "Get used to it, kid," he said. "This is how it's going to be from now on." And in that moment, Jimmy understood. This wasn't a gentleman's sport. It was a meat grinder, an assembly line, fight, refuel, fight. And they were just expendable parts. Jimmy flew 3 sorties that day. When he finally stumbled to his bunk late that evening, he didn't write a letter to his mother. He just collapsed onto the bed and fell into a heavy, dreamless sleep from which he was jolted awake by the wail of a siren the next morning. Finch stood at his office window looking out at the runway. He saw his boys, staggering with fatigue, trudging towards their planes. He saw their extinguished eyes, and in that moment he realized, if they were to survive, he had to be more than just their commander. He had to become their jailer, their dictator, and their god, who would force them to rest, who would forcibly keep them on this side of madness. The old rules of war had died today in the skies over Kent, and he would have to write new ones. Late August, hell had become routine. The words morning, day, and evening had lost their meaning. There was only the time between sirens. Sometimes it was an hour. Sometimes 20 minutes. The pilots lived in a state of permanent adrenaline shock. Their bodies no longer belonged to them. They were machines that needed to be refueled with sugary tea, placed in a cockpit, and aimed at the enemy. Fatigue became their second skin. It wasn't just a lack of sleep. It had become a physical substance, thick as swamp mud. It seeped under their skin, slowed the blood in their veins, filled their muscles with lead, and grated like sand between their teeth, turning 19-year-old boys into stooped old men with hollow, sunken eyes in which only the murky, indifferent horror of the day's events sloshed about. They fell asleep everywhere. At the table in the mess hall, in the armchairs of the ready room, even while climbing to altitude, slipping into a stupor for a few seconds until the roar of the engine jolted them back to reality. Their conversations became short, fragmented. Their humor turned black. Gallows humor. They no longer joked about girls. They joked about who would be next not to return. This wasn't cruelty. It was the only way to stay sane, to build an armor of cynicism to keep from going mad with grief for their lost comrades. Every morning at breakfast they saw empty chairs, and everyone tried not to look at them. Finch watched his squadron fall apart. He saw it in the little things. In the way a pilot, a veteran with 10 victories, couldn't get the key into his locker because his hands were shaking so badly he had to ask a mechanic for help. In the way another, during a briefing, suddenly started laughing for no reason, and the laughter turned into sobs. In the way Jimmy Croft, who in 2 weeks had transformed from an enthusiastic youth into a silent, twitchy old man, would sit for hours staring at a spot on the wall, slowly rocking back and forth. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst part was that fatigue had started to kill. A pilot named David, a cheerful lad from Liverpool, was returning from his 5th sortie of the day. He made a perfect approach, lowered his landing gear, touched down on the runway, and simply didn't cut the engine. His Spitfire raced across the entire airfield at full speed and crashed into a hangar. When they pulled him from the wreckage, the doctor said he was already dead before the impact. He had died of a heart attack, brought on by extreme exhaustion. He had simply fallen asleep at the moment of landing. His death was the point of no return for Finch. He realized the enemy wasn't in the cockpit of a Messerschmitt. The main enemy was inside his pilots' heads, and its name was exhaustion. Finch didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office and wrote a report to Group Command. He wasn't asking for medals or new planes. He was asking for rotation. He begged for them to give his men at least a week of rest, to transfer them to the rear, to replace them with a fresh squadron. He described, in detail and without emotion, the condition of his pilots, citing David's case. He wrote that if this continued, he wouldn't have a single combat-effective pilot left in a month. He sent the report and waited. The reply came 2 days later. It was a short, dry order signed by an Air Vice Marshal. It stated that due to the extreme situation, any talk of rotation was out of the question. The squadron was to continue carrying out its combat duties with maximum efficiency. At the end was a handwritten note. War demands sacrifice, squadron leader. You are a soldier. Do your duty. Finch slowly crumpled the piece of paper. He looked out the window. Arthur Mallory was sitting on the grass, trying to light a cigarette. He struck a match 3 times but couldn't bring it to the cigarette because of his trembling fingers. His best ace, his rock. And even that rock was starting to crumble. Finch realized there would be no rescue. No one was coming to help them. They were alone, trapped on this small island in the middle of a raging ocean of war. And if he didn't do something, they would all drown. At that moment, watching his broken ace, Finch made a decision. If command wouldn't save his men, he would do it himself. He would establish his own laws. He would create his own system. He would become a dictator, a tyrant, whatever it took. But he would pull them out of this abyss, even if it meant breaking their will to do it. It seemed all was lost. There was no hope. But it was then, in the depths of despair, that an idea was born. An idea that was both salvation and madness. An idea that became their unexpected weapon. That very night, Squadron Leader Finch assembled all his officers, the pilots, the doctor, the engineer. He didn't seem himself. His usual granite confidence was gone, replaced by a cold, almost sinister resolve. He spoke quietly, but each of his words dug into their consciousness like a piece of shrapnel. "Gentlemen," he began, "command has refused us. There will be no help. We have been left here to die, either from enemy bullets or from fatigue. I prefer the first option because it's more honest, but I will not watch my pilots crash into the ground because they fall asleep at the controls. From this moment on, new laws are in effect at this airfield. My laws." He paused, fixing everyone with a heavy stare. "First, from now on, any period between sorties longer than 30 minutes is an order to sleep. I don't care if you want to or not. You will sleep. I've ordered cots to be set up right here in the ready room and in the hangar. The mechanics will enforce this. Anyone who refuses will be grounded and court-martialed for disobeying an order in a combat situation." A dead silence hung in the room. The pilot stared at him in disbelief. An order to sleep? It was absurd. "Second," Finch continued, his voice growing harder, "in the mess hall and the ready room, all talk of combat, of losses, of the enemy, is forbidden. We will talk about anything else. The weather, women, horse racing. I've asked Chiefy to fix the record player. From now on, there will be music playing constantly. Calm music. Anyone who violates this order will be on latrine duty for a week." Again, incredulous silence. Arthur Mallory smirked. "Sir, are you suggesting we turn into a finishing school for young ladies while there's a slaughter going on upstairs?" "Precisely, Lieutenant," Finch snapped, locking eyes with his ace. "Up there, you are warriors. Down here, you are patients at a sanatorium. Your only job on the ground is to restore your nervous systems. I am forbidding you to think about the war. I will do the thinking for you." He walked to the table and poured out a handful of small white pills. Benzedrine, the stimulant that helped them stay on their feet but burned their nerves to cinders. "Third, this," he jabbed a finger at the pills, "is now strictly forbidden. The doctor will conduct a search of your personal belongings. Anyone found with stimulants will be considered a saboteur, deliberately undermining the combat effectiveness of the squadron. The punishment will be commensurate." This was too much. A murmur of outrage went through the room. For many, those pills were the only way to force themselves back into the cockpit. "Are you trying to kill us, sir?" someone shouted. "I'm trying to save you!" Finch roared back, the steel returning to his voice. "Don't you understand what's happening? You're already half dead. Your reflexes are shot, your vision is impaired, you are perfect targets. Your body is your primary weapon and it is almost broken. My system is an attempt to fix it. This is not a request, it is an order, and it is not up for discussion." He turned and walked out, leaving his officers in a state of utter shock. His plan was insane. It was illogical. It contradicted everything they knew about war. But there was something in their commander's eyes that made them obey. It was the will of a man pushed to the edge, a man willing to take the most unthinkable measures to save his people. This was the first small victory. A victory not over the enemy, but over chaos, over despair, over themselves. Finch had created a weapon not of steel and gunpowder, but of discipline, music, and forced sleep. He began to build his small empire of order in the midst of universal madness. And though none of the pilots understood it then, it was on that night, in a stuffy room thick with fear, that the foundation of their future victory was laid. They didn't yet know that this strange, almost laughable weapon, the order to sleep, would prove more effective than hundreds of machine guns. But they also didn't know that the hostile environment they were trying to deceive was already preparing its counterattack. And this blow would come not from without, but from within. September 1940. Finch's empire began its work. Life on the airfield turned into a surreal spectacle. Picture this. In the skies over the English Channel, one of the greatest aerial battles in history is unfolding. Dozens of aircraft wheel in a deadly dance. The air is torn by machine gun fire and fiery comets. All that remains of men and their machines fall from the sky. And at the same time on the ground, just a few miles from this hell, in the ready room of Biggin Hill Airfield, a group of young men in flight uniforms lies on cots with their eyes closed. From an old record player, the quiet, lulling melody of Glenn Miller flows. Nearby, the elderly mechanic Chiefy walks with a stick in his hands, and if he notices someone open their eyes or try to speak, he gently taps the bed frame with the stick. This is not a dream. It is an order. Finch had established an iron dictatorship. He personally checked to see that his pilots were sleeping. He introduced a system of rewards and punishments. For an extra 15 minutes of sleep after a sortie, a pilot could get a bar of chocolate. For talking about a downed Messerschmitt, an assignment to peel potatoes. At first, it caused grumbling and ridicule. The pilots felt humiliated. They were knights of the sky, and they were being treated like children during nap time. But after a few days, they began to notice changes. They were still deathly tired, but the dull, leaden weight in their heads began to recede. The tremors in their hands lessened. They found they could focus on their gun sights for a fraction of a second longer, that their reactions were a little sharper. The system was working. Finch had created an artificial world for them, a cocoon that protected their psyches from overload. On the ground, they lived in an illusion of peace and quiet. They read books, listened to music, played chess, and only the wail of the siren ripped them from this illusion and threw them back into the reality of war. These transitions were monstrous. In 1 minute, a man had to switch from a state of sleepy calm to maximum combat readiness. It was like diving from a warm bath into ice water. But it was better than being in that ice water constantly. Finch became their absolute authority. His word was law. He was their dictator, their savior, their jailer. They both hated and worshipped him. He took away their free will on the ground, but gave them extra seconds of life in the sky. Their little empire gave them more than just physical recovery. It gave them something more: structure, order. In a world of absolute chaos, where life and death were decided in seconds, they had their own unshakable routine. Sleep, music, tea, combat. This rhythm was hypnotic, calming, keeping their minds from shattering. They turned into a perfectly tuned mechanism. Their squadron, which had recently been on the verge of collapse, began to achieve the best results in the entire group. They shot down more and lost fewer. Command was delighted, not delving into the methods by which this was achieved. But this system had a dark side. The pilots became increasingly detached, mechanical. They acted like automatons, without emotion, without fear, but also without joy. They were shadows of their former selves, and not everyone could withstand it. The system that saved the weak began to break the strong. Arthur Mallory, their best ace, suffered the most. He was a born hunter. He needed the adrenaline. He needed the rage of battle. It was his fuel. Finch's system deprived him of it. It forced him to extinguish the fire within him, turning him from a wolf into a sheep. He obeyed because he was a soldier, but a protest was brewing inside him. He saw this system not as salvation, but as humiliation. He believed Finch was taking away the last thing they had left, their fighting spirit. He began to argue with the commander, quietly at first, then more and more fiercely. He demanded they abolish the kindergarten and let them fight like men. This conflict, smoldering beneath the ashes of iron discipline, was a time bomb, and it was bound to explode. Their life had fallen into a harsh but predictable rhythm. But not everyone was prepared to live by the laws of this new world. In the soul of the squadron's best pilot, a rebellion began to fester. The conflict between Finch and Mallory reached its peak on one of the first days of September. It had been a particularly hard day. 4 sorties from dawn till noon. The squadron had lost 2 pilots. Returning after the 4th battle, Mallory, who had 2 downed junkers to his name that day, headed straight for the makeshift bar instead of going to sleep. He poured himself a full glass of whiskey and downed it in one gulp. Finch found him there. "Arthur, you need to rest. There could be another sortie in an hour," he said calmly. Mallory turned slowly. His eyes burned with a feverish, unhealthy fire. "I can't sleep anymore, Commander," he snarled. "When I close my eyes, I see their faces. The faces of the men we lost today. The faces of the men I shot down. Your music doesn't help. Your ridiculous nap time is torture. The only thing that helps is the fight. Up there, I don't think. I act. Up there, I'm alive. Down here, in your sanatorium, I'm slowly dying." His voice was breaking. It was the cry of a soul pushed to its limit. He was not an antagonist by choice. He was the embodiment of the part of each of them that refused to accept the role of a victim, that wanted to fight, to kill, to avenge. He was the voice of their desperation, cloaked in the form of heroism. "You're wrong, Arthur," Finch replied quietly but firmly. "Up there, you're burning yourself out. Every minute of combat cost you a month of your life. You're running on adrenaline and nerves. But that credit is about to run out. And then you just won't pull out of a dive. I've seen it dozens of times. The system isn't here to make you feel good. It's here to keep you alive." "I don't want to live like this!" Mallory shouted, slamming his fist on the bar. "I don't want to be a robot that you switch on and off by command. I'm a fighter pilot, not a wind-up toy." "You're not flying again today, Arthur," Finch said in an icy tone. "You're grounded for 24 hours. That's an order." Mallory froze, staring at his commander with a disbelief that turned to fury. "You can't do that. I'm your best pilot. While I'm in here drinking whiskey, my boys will be dying up there. It's precisely because you are the best that I'm grounding you." Finch stepped closer, looking Mallory straight in the eye. "You've become addicted to combat, like a junkie to his fix. You're a danger to yourself and to others. You will go, and you will sleep. If I have to, I'll post a guard at your door." This was surgical cruelty in its purest form. Finch was amputating a gangrenous limb to save the whole organism. He was sacrificing the combat effectiveness of one pilot in the short term to avoid losing him forever. For Mallory, this was the last straw. He looked at Finch with hatred, turned and staggered toward the exit. The other pilots who had witnessed the scene were silent. They sympathized with Mallory, but deep down, each of them knew Finch was right. They had seen what their ace was becoming. They'd seen the madness in his eyes. The internal enemy had been defeated. The rebellion was crushed. But while they were dealing with their internal conflict, they failed to notice that their real enemy, the Luftwaffe, was preparing its final, devastating blow. Less than half an hour had passed when the siren wailed over the airfield again, but this time, its cry was different. It was more insistent, more alarming. A communications officer ran into the ready room, his face pale. "Sir," he yelled to Finch, "intelligence reports a massive formation. Over 1,000 aircraft. They're heading straight for London, the 15th of September, 1940. The day that would later go down in history as Battle of Britain Day. This was the ultimate test, the climax of the air war. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the fight in a desperate attempt to break the resistance of the Royal Air Force and pave the way for an invasion. For Finch's squadron, this was the moment of truth. Everything they had been through, all their suffering, all their pain, it all came down to this day, this hour. The order was simple. Scramble everything that can fly. Defend London at all costs. Finch ran out of the headquarters and saw his pilots running towards their planes. His system, his empire, was working. They moved quickly, in unison, without panic. They were tired, exhausted, but they were ready to fight. And then he saw Mallory. His grounding wasn't over yet, but he was standing by his Spitfire as mechanics refueled it and loaded ammunition. Finch ran up to him. "Arthur, I gave you an order." Mallory didn't even look at him. He was looking at the sky to the south, from where the black cloud of enemy planes was approaching. "My whole squadron is up there, sir," he said quietly. "I can't stay behind." Finch looked at him. The feverish glint was gone from the ace's eyes. There was only a cold, deadly resolve, and an infinite weariness. Finch knew it was useless to argue. He also knew that perhaps this was the very fight Mallory needed to either burn out completely or be cleansed in its fire. "All right," Finch nodded. "But you're flying as my wingman, and you don't leave my side. Is that clear?" Mallory nodded silently and climbed into the cockpit. A few minutes later, the entire squadron was airborne. What they saw as they approached London surpassed anything they had ever witnessed. The sky was literally choked with planes. It wasn't a battle. It was a brawl. Thousands of tons of metal hurtling towards each other at hundreds of miles per hour. Finch and his pilots tore into this armada like a spear into the body of a giant beast. He lost sight of Mallory almost immediately. The battle broke down into dozens of individual duels. Jimmy Croft, no longer a rookie but a seasoned veteran, fought like a man possessed. He shot down a bomber, then a fighter, evaded an attack from his six, and got on the tail of another Messerschmitt himself. He no longer thought about the faces of the German pilots. He thought only about how to survive and complete his mission. He used everything he had learned, in flight school and in the hellish meat grinder of the past weeks. He even used Finch's lessons. He breathed steadily. He forced himself to relax his muscles. He conserved every gram of energy. He was the perfect product of the system. Finch fought like a lion protecting his chicks. He shot down 2 Messerschmitts that were trying to attack a flight of newcomers. His own plane was damaged, smoke pouring from the engine, but he stayed in the fight. And then he saw it. Slightly below and to his left, Arthur Mallory's Spitfire was fighting 6 Messerschmitts alone. It was pure madness. Suicide. But it was also something incredible. Mallory was flying in a way none of them could. His plane was an extension of his body, of his will. He twisted, turned, dodged attacks at the last possible second while delivering short, precise bursts of his own. He was an artist, painting a masterpiece of death in the sky. He shot down 1, then a second. The remaining 4 closed in on him. Finch dived to help, but he was too far away. He watched as streams of tracers from all sides slammed into Mallory's plane. The Spitfire shuddered, and thick black smoke began to pour from it. It started to fall. "Arthur, bail out!" Finch screamed into his microphone. There was no answer. Mallory's plane was tumbling uncontrollably toward the earth. Finch watched, frozen in horror, as his best pilot, his friend, his main adversary, hurtled towards the ground. And in that moment, in the sudden silence when it seemed all was lost, He saw a small white dome of a parachute blossom against the smoke-filled London sky. The battle ended as abruptly as it began. The enemy armada, having suffered massive losses, turned back. The sky over London was clear. They had won. The price of victory was terrible. The squadron lost a third of its men. But London was saved. The Battle of Britain was won. When Finch landed, he saw a farmer's truck driving towards the airfield. In the back, covered in soot, his face burned, but alive, sat Arthur Mallory. Their eyes met. And in that moment, there was no longer any conflict between them, no resentment. Only the silent understanding and respect of two men who had stared into the abyss together and returned. Late September, October, 1940. The intensity of the raids decreased. The Luftwaffe switched to night bombing, and a period of relative calm began for the daytime fighter squadrons. The Battle of Britain was won, and fame descended upon the pilots who, just yesterday, had been mere cannon fodder. Their photos were splashed across the newspapers. They were called the saviors of the nation, the few, about whom Churchill had spoken his famous words. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. They were invited to receptions, presented with medals, recognized on the streets. To the country they were heroes, knights without fear or blame. But this salvation, this triumphant return to the real world, turned into a new, no less brutal ordeal for them. The irony of civilization was that it demanded they be symbols, poster heroes, while they were just men with shattered souls. They couldn't live up to that image. The noisy receptions drove them mad after months spent in the relative quiet of the airfield. Journalists' questions about heroic duels seemed like a mockery. How could they tell these well-fed, smiling people what it was like to watch your friend burn alive in the cockpit of his plane? How could they explain the kind of fatigue that turns you into a zombie? They smiled for the cameras, shook the outstretched hands, but their eyes remained empty. They were strangers at this celebration of life, a celebration they themselves had fought to preserve. Their feat, their incredible story of survival based on Finch's system, turned out to be an inconvenient truth. War propaganda demanded stories of fearless heroes, not of men who had to be forced to sleep to keep from going insane. Finch was summoned to headquarters. He was congratulated on the squadron's outstanding results and awarded the Distinguished Service Order. And then, one of the air marshals took him aside and said, "Squadron leader, we've heard rumors about your unorthodox methods of maintaining discipline. We appreciate your initiative, but we ask that you refrain from such experiments in the future. And of course, this whole story must not leave your squadron. It could be misinterpreted by the public." Finch understood. Their achievement, their unique weapon, the system of survival, was to be forgotten. It didn't fit into the glorious picture of war. The culmination of this clash with the cynicism of the system was a medal ceremony at Buckingham Palace. Arthur Mallory, his burns healed, was to receive the Distinguished Flying Cross from the King himself. He stood in line with the other heroes, impeccably dressed, his face impassive. But when his name was called, he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at a single point, his body racked by a fine tremor. Two officers approached and, taking him by the arms, tried to lead him away. But he wouldn't walk. He had fallen into a state of complete stupor, the same state Finch had found him in before the decisive battle. It was a nervous breakdown. Quiet, unnoticed by most, but no less terrifying for it. He was quickly, almost invisibly, escorted from the hall. The next day, the newspapers reported that Flight Lieutenant Mallory had been unable to attend the ceremony due to the effects of his injuries. Their brotherhood, forged in the hell of the skies, was stronger than any orders. But their real feat was buried alive under the stamp of classified and the gloss of official propaganda. They had won the war against the enemy, but lost the war against the system that had created them, used them, and then cast them aside like spent cartridges. The war ended. The fanfares faded. The flags were lowered. For the world, peace had come. But for the few, their personal war never ended. They returned home, but they could not return to their old lives. The experience had changed them forever, leaving deep, unhealing scars on their souls. Scars that were then called battle fatigue, but today would be called post-traumatic stress disorder. Their fates varied, but nearly everyone was shadowed by that battle. Squadron leader Alistair Finch, the Steel Rod, the man who had pulled his squadron from hell by the sheer force of his will, retired from the RAF almost immediately after the war. He settled in a small village in Devon and took up rose gardening. He never spoke of the war. When locals or the rare journalists tried to ask him about the Battle of Britain, he would politely change the subject or simply walk away. His granite face became even more impenetrable, and a deep, inconsolable sadness settled permanently in his eyes. He grew the best roses in the county but could never cultivate peace in his own soul. He died in 1972 from a heart attack. Among his papers, they found an old, battered squadron logbook. Next to the name of each fallen pilot, he had written in his own hand not the number of enemies shot down, but some personal detail. Loved jazz. Dreamed of becoming an architect. Had a fiancée named Mary. He remembered them not as soldiers, but as the boys he had failed to save. Arthur Mallory, the voice of despair, the brilliant ace, never recovered from his breakdown. He was medically discharged from the RAF. He spent several years in veterans' clinics. Doctors tried to treat him with electroshock therapy, but it only worsened his condition. He emerged from the clinic a broken man, a shadow of the brilliant, furious pilot he had once been. He tried many jobs but could never hold one for long. The noise of cities, sharp sounds, it all sent him back to the roaring cockpit of his Spitfire. He lived his final years in complete seclusion in a small cottage on the coast of Scotland, where the only sounds were the cries of gulls and the roar of the surf. James Croft, Jimmy, the price of survival, who had arrived at the squadron, an enthusiastic youth, survived the war. He saw it through to the end, became an experienced pilot, but that first battle, that first enemy he shot down whose face he had seen, haunted him for the rest of his life. He suffered from nightmares and panic attacks. He couldn't be in crowds. He married, had children, but his family always felt that a part of him had remained there in the skies of 1940. He became a quiet, withdrawn man who found solace only in long solitary walks. Chiefy, the old mechanic, the silent ally, returned to his auto repair shop after the war. He too never spoke of what he had seen, but all his customers knew that every year on the 15th of September, Chiefy's garage was closed. On that day, he would drive to the old, abandoned Biggin Hill airfield, sit on the edge of the runway, and just look at the sky. He would sit there until sunset, and no one knew what he was thinking. Perhaps he was once again seeing his boys, his hawks, leaving for their final battle. The official history of the Battle of Britain is written in the dry language of numbers and facts. It contains loss statistics, diagrams of air battles, squadron names, and the names of aces who shot down the most enemy aircraft. In these books, you will find the names of Finch and Mallory, but it will only say that one was an effective commander and the other an outstanding pilot. There will not be a single word about forced sleep, about a record player playing Glenn Miller under the wail of sirens, about the rebellion of the top ace, or about the dictatorship that saved dozens of lives. The official history buried their true achievement, deeming it too inconvenient, too unheroic. But history is not just what is written in books. There's another history, one that lives in the memory of people, passed down by word of mouth, turning into legend. And the story of Finch's squadron became just such a legend. Among RAF pilots and mechanics, rumors of the sleeping squadron circulated for a long time. It was said that squadron leader Finch had his own special training methods, that his pilots were immune to fatigue and fear. They told stories of how they flew like sleepwalkers, like ghosts, and that was why the Germans couldn't shoot them down. A belief arose that if a young pilot found himself in a hopeless situation over the English Channel, a lone ghost Spitfire would sometimes appear from the clouds, help him, and then vanish just as suddenly. And on the side of that Spitfire, they said, were the initials AM. The story turned into a myth, a soldier's tale told to rookies in flight schools. It lost its factual accuracy, but it kept its essence. The essence that the most terrible war is not the war against an external enemy. It is the war with oneself, with one's own body, with one's own mind, pushed to the absolute limit. This story is not just a chronicle of a forgotten feat. It is a reminder that behind the glitter of victories and parades, there is always the quiet, invisible tragedy of the people who paid an exorbitant price for that victory. It is a story about how sometimes the greatest heroism is not to charge at the enemy, but to simply force yourself to close your eyes and try to sleep, knowing that in an hour the siren will sound again, and you will have to return to hell. And as long as we remember these stories, the feat of the few will live on, not in official reports, but in our hearts.